Pacific Northwest is the one part of the country I don't know well.
Well, it's so great to be here today with Chris Arnade. Hi, Chris.
Hello, how are you? Thank you
Good.
for having me.
Well, I'm really excited. I'm just going to show everybody your book here. I'm sure they've all heard of it already, but Chris Arnade wrote this wonderful book, Dignity. And I had heard many people talking about it. And then when I got this opportunity to talk with you personally, I got the book for myself so I could read it. So I'm pumped, and it's a real privilege to be able to talk with someone who has the range of experience that you have. And so really looking forward to getting to know you better.
Fantastic. Same here.
One of the things I always like to do with a new guest is to start with, maybe you could tell me a little bit about yourself, like how you grew up to become who you are. And I'm especially interested in how you got to the place originally of becoming a PhD in physics, and then what motivated your switch to Wall Street trading.
Right. So I don't know how much detail you want, but I grew up in a small southern town, 500 people. It was odd for a southern town because it was all Catholic, and we weren't Catholic. My father was a refugee from Nazi Germany.
Oh my goodness.
And so he settled there for who knows why, but we had a lot of kids. Him and my mother had lots of children, 7. I'm the youngest of 7. And we were something of an outsider in our town because we had come to the town in the late 50s, early 60s. And most of the people in the town had been there for generations.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a professor, and I was raised in a working class southern town, and by a professor, which was a bit of an oddity. I was raised Catholic, even though he was Jewish. But I eventually discovered, somewhat by accident, I guess, that I was good at math. It was something that just came naturally to me for whatever reason. And that was rare because that nobody in my family was. My mother was analytic, but very few of my brothers or sisters were the type to be focused on math. But I was, and how did I get to become a PhD in physics? It sounds a bit odd, but it was like the path of least resistance. I was just really good at it, and so when we did problem sets, I was always the one who just zoomed through the math problem sets, and then we were assigned the even numbers. I did the even and odd just because it was fun to me. I was just kind of that person. It was just something I liked to do. And as I got to college, I realized I was better than I realized I was at math, and I enjoyed it, and I learned about pure math, and I kind of went from there to just getting a PhD in physics because I got involved into the idea of the big questions, like, what was the shape of the universe? How did it all begin? Those sort of things. And that was the natural way for me to approach those issues because I had that sort of mindset, and I was generally found myself becoming more and more focused on what I would call rationalism and scientism as opposed to faith. I had left the church pretty early and pretty dramatically as a kid. And so that arc of my life was all about kind of becoming very science-y. And when I got my PhD in physics, I did that at Baltimore, at Johns Hopkins. There was a confluence of events that made me realize that's not what I wanted to do in my life. I wasn't as good at it as one needed to be to do that for the rest of your life. And I started getting bored with it, to be honest, and wanted to do something different. And that led me to Wall Street, believe it or not, because it was, again, something that kind of fell in my lap, which is I was just searching for things to do with my PhD in physics, and I tried a host of different things. During my last year of grad school, I was writing my thesis and realized I wasn't going to go further in physics than this. And so I just spent a lot of time in my basement just reading different subjects. And I did meteorology for a while, and then eventually finance just kind of seemed natural. It was easy to do. And I mean, to be blunt, they paid well, and I was kind of wanting to raise a family and looking forward to moving, kind of trying a different challenge, as it were. And at that time, finance was a challenge to me. It was more real, putting my kind of mathematical skills to the real world test. And I ended up doing 20 years of being a bond trader, working in finance. If any of your listeners have seen the movie Big Short or read the book Liar's Poker, that was me. I think I don't know if Liar's Poker is still famous or not, but that was the firm I joined, Salomon Brothers, which is where Liar's Poker is set.
Well, so were you working on like big data analysis, or were you just doing actual trading kind of?
Actual trading, but the type of trading I did was based on, it's called macro trading. It's kind of going around the world and trying to kind of analyze countries and think about where they're going to go and how to invest in them, and it was literally betting on events, how the events in the world, current events and how they would play out and how to make money off of that.
So you were looking at modeling? Is
Yeah.
that?
I mean, I was a model-based trader, if you call it that, but my math was initially used a lot, but then became used less and less. It was more of the mindset of being very analytical and kind of looking through patterns and trying to put together pieces using kind of what I would call toy models, putting together models based on how to think about the world, with the end goal of making money. So, it was a very blunt, utilitarian way of approaching life. But what I had left out of when I was raised, one of the things we traveled a lot as a children. My family traveled a lot, and to places that were not famous for, were not inviting places. My father specialized basically in conflict, and so where there was conflict, we went. And so he brought the whole crew of us, my mother and him, marched the whole 7 of us all around the world. So I kind of was an outsider on Wall Street in many ways, but I had this habit as a child of always exploring different places. So when I did get to New York City, one of the things I did to keep myself, to balance the banking, but also because that's what I like to do, was just walk everywhere. I'd make long 20-mile walks, 15-mile walks, 25-mile walks, all around the city. That's what I did on the weekend when I could get away from the children, when I had some free time. And those walks, eventually I brought my camera along, and that ultimately evolved into what the book you have in your hands became. Those walks took over everything, and I quit my job and focused on those walks. And I kind of did it all around the country, not just walking, but I drove from place to place, and then I would get to a different place and just walk and talk to people and tell their stories and listen to their stories and take photographs of them. And that ultimately became the book.
Well, when you first started photographing them, did you have in mind that you might eventually write those stories down, or were you
Absolutely not. No.
you were just interested in photography in general as a hobby?
Just interested. It was a stress reduction. It was just also a way of learning. It went from being a stress reduction, or just a hobby, as it were, which is to just kind of, the walks usually had a point to them that were not about listening to stories. They were like, I think I tried to walk the entire length of the New York City subway system above ground. So I called them my terminus walks. I would take the subway to the end of the line and then walk home. But over those course of those walks, I'd meet people. And then my walks evolved into kind of becoming more about the people I met and the places that they suggested I go. And when I started bringing the camera, which was I think around 2007 or so, it really changed the dynamic of the walks, because I became a photographer for one. I'm focused on the photographs, but also the people I photographed would want to tell me their story. And so I started writing their stories down and then publishing the photos with the little stories. And eventually the stories became more important than the story than the photos. Uh,
I
and
thought that's a very unique thing as I was reading the book, that that people actually engaged more with you when you had the camera. I would have thought it would have been the other way around, that they would avoid you because you had a camera.
no, it's kind of interesting. As a lot of the places I went, I was clearly the outsider. I mean, as you can obviously see, I'm white, and the bulk of the places I went were not white at all, Hispanic or black. And the camera was a way to kind of, people could come up and ask me basically, what the hell am I doing here? And they almost everybody obviously the people who are in the book wanted their pictures taken, but almost everybody else wanted their pictures taken. And when someone didn't want their picture taken, well, I would never try to ask them. I generally let people ask me to let me take, if they want, so that the process was that they, I would never try to strong arm anybody into having their picture taken.
Mhm.
But yeah, people when you walk through what is considered a poor neighborhood or a rough neighborhood or whatever stigmatizing term you want to attach to them, as an outsider with a camera, people will approach you.
See, I just find that so fascinating because I lived in Japan for 3 years back in the late 80s, and our family, there were four of us, and well, I guess there were three of us at the time. And my daughter was kind of blondish, a little bit more blonde than I am. And oftentimes the Japanese people would run into their house and get a camera and come running out to take our picture because they wanted a picture of her because she was blonde. And
That happened to me when in the 70s when I was in Philippines as a small blonde kid.
that,
Yeah, people, we would travel. We would stay in quote rough sections, poor sections, and um, the people would come up, and a lot of people would come up and grab my hair and touch it and smile and laugh. And no, nobody would have. People weren't wealthy enough to have pick cameras, but they would touch my hair.
that they were always touching her. Japanese people don't have any body hair, so they were always touching her arms because they want to touch the hair on her arms. but the other side of that is, when we were in Europe on a vacation one time, I had my camera with me all the time because I'm a painter and I like taking photographs of something I might want to paint later. So if I wanted to take pictures of people, I'd always have to kind of sneak the photograph because people were very reluctant to have their photographs taken. Very, very reluctant. They would get quite upset with me sometimes if they noticed me taking their photograph.
Yeah, um, I'm very um, no pictures. Every picture was agreed to that I've taken. I think there was one exception of a time when I took a picture of something that somebody didn't want me to take their picture, but I've never published it, and I used it just as a memory for me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in general, my photographs are portraits more than anything.
Yeah.
Um, and so
Well, I mean, I just found even when I would ask people often, I mean, almost always they would say no, they didn't want their photograph taken. So I just think your experience is so interesting because I think that also tells something about the community that you were working with, that you were talking to.
yeah, they're pretty tired of being stigmatized, and so they believe that you have good intentions, which I hope you know comes across with what I do.
Mm-hmm.
Then they open up. But again, there was a lot of time spent. It wasn't just dart in, take a picture, dart out. It was for my time in the Bronx, which takes up a lot of the book. That was 3 years. That was 3 years of coming back all the time and almost every day, um, to get that sort of openness from people, and and also helping them out. The fact that I help people out and would visit them in jail or take them to the hospital or take them to detox or, to be blunt, take them to buy drugs, helped the relationship, helped there was something in it for them. I've been criticized for that, for helping them, but I have no problems helping people. So.
Well, so I noticed that on page 14, you made this comment. You said you realized that you needed to stop trying to save them, but just to listen and understand. And I was contemplating that, and I thought, did you mean that you stopped trying to save them because you realized that trying to save them was in some way counterproductive, or was it something else that was going on there?
A little bit of arrogant, who am I to tell someone how to live? It's kind of like, there was a counterproductive thing, which is, they have their way of thinking about life, and everybody has their way of thinking about life. I have my way of thinking about life, and, my ideas of success are not their ideas of success. So it's trying to appreciate how they view the world and help them obtain that, even if I disagree with it. I'm and there is that. And then there's the additional thing that it wasn't working. Driving someone to detox only to find them 5 hours later having run away from detox. Why do it the ninth time?
Mm.
So there was the issue of kind of presumption of knowing what's better for somebody, as opposed to just listen. And also, what I thought worked didn't work, and just giving, there was some level of acceptance and some level of giving up.
Hmm. Well, one of the things I really noticed about your writing is that it's, I guess I would characterize it as brutally straightforward. And I wondered if that came naturally to you as your method of communication, or did you work at developing that style for this book, for this purpose?
I don't like cliches, and as a writer, I'm very much believe in just kind of keeping it simple. And I think that's how I operate with people as well, which is to kind of, I think some of my personality comes off as kind of a bit of a Wall Street guy at times, which is being very blunt and very kind of forthright, and cutting to the chase, like, getting rid of all the niceties and just like saying, okay, what can I do to help you, or what do you want, or or like, what's going on here, as opposed to trying to. But there was a lot of time put in developing relationships, and so I wanted to keep myself out of the books to the most, as much as possible, and make the book about the people I met. And in that sense, that meant putting their words in, and not making it fancy. So one of the things I had a lot of back and forth with my publisher was, I like the style of the interview of them, me, very blunt. Just what I said, what they responded, as opposed to trying to turn that into kind of fancy language where I write, then I said, and then they responded, and then I said.
Uh-huh.
It took me some arm twisting to get them to accept that, but I think that's the best approach, both for trying to communicate what happened, but also keeping myself out of it as more than just a questioner. And not putting my emphasis, I find it frustrating when I read people who turn dialogue into kind of large paragraphs, when it really should just be me, them, me, them, me, them.
Mm-hmm.
So there was some thought going on to the style.
Yeah, the way you describe the circumstances, and I mean the stories themselves are so desperately sad and painful, and but I really appreciated the way that you backed off from sentimentality.
That was very intentional, meaning, which is, I like to let respect the reader to figure out what's going on for themselves,
Mhm.
and to not clutter things up. I'm a big believer in, being very simple in communication. And so, to the degree I have a writing style, is to to go through each sentence and see if the word is unnecessarily complex and can it be replaced with something simpler. You know, I don't need to use big words a lot. At least I hope I try not to. What I do wish I had done more of, um, and what kind of got lost in the writing, I think, is some of the humor that took place. I include some of it early on. I think there's some humor, but I wish I had included more, or maybe I don't remember how the edits came, but I do wish I had made it a little bit more um, to give a little bit more sense that there were moments of levity going on. There were funny moments,
Mhm.
and that it wasn't just intense pain. Although that was there, that even during this pain, people managed to find, to live. And part of life is laughing.
Well, you are, throughout this book, you introduce us to the very real people that have been affected by the economic choices that were made in the face of, I would say, in the face of rising global competition. Would that be a fair characterization?
That's a fair characterization.
Yeah. So you said in long towards the beginning of the book, I think maybe page 50, you said something like, in the name of economic growth, more efficiency, and higher profits, we opened our borders to a flood of cheaper products coming in and a flood of factories and jobs moving away to lower labor costs, no matter what. So I was wondering, I know that towards the end of the book, you do talk about what you think of as some solutions, but I'm wondering, as you've thought about it, what would have been a more productive stance to have taken in the face of that existing growth of global competition?
I think nationalism has a bad name these days because it gets tied up with a lot of unsavory characters, but I think economic nationalism is not a bad thing. I think putting labor over profits. To that degree, I come from the left in the sense that I truly believe that there was never one decision. It's never one decision. It's death by 1,000 decisions. It's death by 1,000 cuts. But this general belief that whatever is good for profits um, is good for the nation, when in fact I feel like it's the opposite of that. I think you don't have to get into a arms race, a resume arms race with the entire country. You don't have to pit all workers against each other. You can, we're a very unique country in that we basically have everything we need here. Very few places other than the Soviet Union, ourselves, and maybe Brazil are gifted with so many resources that we really don't have. I think, between us and Canada, we have everything. And I don't feel like we need to prioritize going faster and faster and faster all the time, when we should just calm down and say, wait a second, whoa, what about life? What about life isn't all about how much stuff we can have and how cheap it is. It's about how communities thrive. And I feel like very much all the decisions that were made in aggregate since roughly Jimmy Carter, since his administration, have been to put profits over community health. You know, and I don't think anybody just sits there. It's not like 5 people sit there and say, how are we going to destroy labor? It's just that in aggregate, all decisions, well, it's kind of like one of those things where you have a weighted dice, and the dice is weighted towards profits and away from labor. So you roll it 1,000 times, and 800 of the results are going to come up against labor, and 200 of the results are going to come up for labor. But the result is, over time, it just erodes the value of workers and how meaningful they are. But I think it's more than that. I think it's not just those decisions. It's just we as a culture, and I think people are very scared of talking about culture because it has such negative connotations. But as a culture, we overvalue certain things and undervalue other things, and we overvalue, again, I think, gratification, material gratification, versus kind of more spiritual gratification or hard to define things. And so I think it's left people feeling a lot of people feeling very much like they don't have a place, and kind of like, I don't like using analogies, but to use a cliche and analogy, kind of like just like leaves drifting in the wind with no place to call home, or no sense of no sense of place.
Yeah, well, there's no question but we're facing a huge meaning crisis in this country, and a lot of it has to do with this: where do we get our gratification? But as I pondered, and I was talking about this with my husband too, because he works in high tech, and he's responsible for making sure that the product can go out at a price that's going to be competitive in the market. And so then you have to make decisions about how do you make it competitive, where do you get it manufactured, what kind of parts you're going to put in it so that it's high enough quality but low enough cost, and all those decisions that have to be made. And the difficult thing that's inside of that is that if you make the wrong decisions, and let's say you opt to have everything manufactured in the United States, and the price is too high and it's not competitive and you can't sell it anywhere,
Right.
the whole company goes, and then you've lost all the employees. So all of the employment opportunities are gone.
Right. But again, the system, you can't, no one company can fight the system now.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's been built, it's here. And I guess I would just simply say that was a choice we made as a culture. And we have to live with it now. And
Well, but what I'm trying to get at is what would have been would the alternate choice have been to say, we're not going to open up to trade with other nations, we're only going to be internal?
I think there's a balance, there's a pendulum, as I keep saying, free tradeism is a vastly oversimplified term. Trade agreements with Mexico are literally 18 books long. They're massive. You can have it ebbs and flows, and I think we've gone too extreme in prioritizing, um, forgetting about the consequences of some of our actions at home and what they do to people's lives. I think economists call it externalities. We've forgotten about the cost of these externalities. So I'm not suggesting we scrap it entirely and just put, massive tariffs on everything, but I think we just need to move back and rethink about how we approach. But again, I don't see that happening. I can't propose you 10 things that will do that. It's just a cultural shift that has to take place, and which is partially why I don't offer solutions, because I don't know how we go there. The perfect example I have is, and as you point out, if one company decides to be the quote good player, they're going to lose out, because that's not the way, you can't fight the system if the system is built for as it is, and so you have to change the system. So being a noble, it's like Brooks Brothers just defaulted yesterday, the clothing manufacturer, and it's done, quote, refused to move its factories overseas, and so it has higher cost, and eventually that it just couldn't. COVID did it in. It was having a rough go of it, but now it's done. And so, as you point out, good for them, but but I think there's a balance you can strike. I think the problem has come when you can have these big businesses that have free trade and operate on that, but they need to, if they're locally owned, I think there's a much different attitude they have towards the communities that they serve. It's like LL Bean in Maine still has local ownership, and consequently, I think they I think there's a lot of employees who feel well about them, and they make decisions that at the margin probably cost their shareholders money, but that's not that they don't care.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a balance there you can have, where when a company is owned by people, when a company is operating in a place where there's no ownership, I think that's the worst case.
Well, so as I was thinking about the scope of the problem that's laid out in this book, and it's something that I think probably most Americans don't like to look at. They don't want to think about it. And yet you kind of put it front and center in our face with this book, which is so excellent. But so much of what you bring up in here seems to sort of be embedded in the whole addiction problem. And I noticed I thought I read in there someplace that you had some background in addiction studies or.
No, but the book the project started off when it became a project, when the walks turned into a project, the 3 years in the Bronx, it was about addiction. And it's kind of what I focused on at the time, because the people I focused on were homeless addicts or heroin users. And so addiction, that was my first experience with addiction. And so it's where I ended up spending a lot of time focusing on for 3 years and reading about and trying to understand. So addiction forms a very central part of the book. And it was a springboard for me to realizing that these problems, it was kind of the canary in the coal mine, as it were, that if we have this immense addiction problem in this country, that has to say something else is rotten at the core. It's a symptom of a greater problem. And when I left the Bronx and spent the next 3 years driving all around the country, I was trying to understand the deeper problem, but not forgetting about addiction being one of the facets of it.
Well, so with addiction being the scope of the addiction problem being what it is, obviously you can have addiction in people even that are well off. I mean, there's a lot of Wall Street traders probably that are addicted to cocaine just as well as people on the lower end of the economic scale. But this addiction thing seems to me, once you start thinking about it and some of the stories that you tell, it sounds as though a lot of these people got hooked into the addiction cycle very early in life, maybe going back even as far as like junior high. And it's so clear to see how the addiction would have affected everything about their life going forward. Because I don't know if you've heard of John Vervaeke, who's done this series of videos on the meaning crisis.
No, I haven't.
Very, very interesting stuff. And he goes through all of the philosophers from the beginning of time until now, and looking at how our vision of the world has changed over time and how it has.
What's his last name?
Vervaeke, Vervaeke.
I'm just writing it down.
Yeah. And I'll put a link in the show notes underneath too, so that everybody can see these videos. In one of his videos, he's talking about a problem that he calls reciprocal narrowing. And reciprocal narrowing is the relationship between the agent and the arena, or between the individual and the world they live in. And when you interact with the world you live in such a way that your arena, your world, gets a little bit smaller, that impacts your behavior. And then your behavior impacts the size of the world that you're in. And addiction is like that, where you get a little bit depressed because the world that you're living in is not what you expected it to be. So then you start using some sort of a substance, and that makes your world a little bit smaller. And then then everything revolves around the need. Eventually, that's all that there is. So your world has narrowed down into this very tightly wound up little very small world. And that reciprocal narrowing, once that thing starts, it's very hard to undo that. So you kind of lose any sense of, I could have a better life. I mean, when I was reading some of the stories in there of some of these young women that end up on the streets selling themselves because that's the only way they can get the next hit. And then by the time they're 35 years old, all they can think about is suicide, because what else? Life only consists of the John and the hit, the John and the hit. And it seems to me that when we think about solutions, we need to start thinking about solutions that get to people when they're much younger, much younger. So we had a guy at our church a few weeks ago, our online church, and he was an African-American pastor talking about how important it is to try to get people to volunteer to tutor children up through third grade at least, so that the child, by the time they're in third grade, is either at or above grade level in reading. Because if you can do that, you can increase by 5 times their likelihood of graduating from high school and going on to college. Now, I go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying that the stories that you tell, I mean, even as I say this, I'm well aware that in the stories that you tell, it seems impossible for those children to have that kind of an opportunity to even get that kind of an education. I mean, children that are being driven around in shopping carts filled with a homeless person's goods, you know, it's
Yeah, it's a rough start. I think
rough start.
the process you said, I think I call it rejection. The sense of you're rejected, and so you flee. In this case, they're often physically rejected by their family. A lot of spiritual rejection too. But so you flee, and when you find other people, you kind of find the other island of misfit toys, and then you guys bond over your shared rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the narrowing of the world, and then it becomes who you are. So you're defined by your rejection. And that gets back to one of the earlier questions you asked about saving people, which is, this is who they are now. So to save them means to what? To bring them back to a society that rejected them, or that they feel rejects them, that they don't like because it rejects them because it's not who they are. So it's a very hard problem. You know, there's this term in addiction I call owning the stigma, and where you rejected so many times, you eventually make it who you are. Like, if you keep calling me a dirty addict, well, then I'm going to say I'm a dirty addict, and I'm going to be proud of being a dirty addict. I'm going to own the stigma. You're going to stigmatize me, then I'm going to be that person you say I am.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this process by which being the addict becomes the form of meaning. But it's also a lot more than that. You know, I look back when I first started hanging out with these homeless addicts, and how naive I was at some level, because I remember them saying, to Keisha, telling me, well, you know, Barbara's my my sister. I'm like, wow, what a small world, like, you guys both ended up here, but she been her street sister. It wasn't her blood relative. I mean, it took about a day to figure that one out. That they call each other brother, sister, mother, father. And there's this they form street families that are as important as become more important than the real family, because it's the way that if you pass away, your street mother gets your possessions, or your street sister gets your possessions. It becomes a kind of code to how to structure your life. But also, as there's a lot of is a very good metaphor for the fact that they've replaced their blood family with their street family because they've been rejected by their or didn't have a chance to be, or they rejected them, their blood family because it was so awful, and they formed a new family, which was they found on the streets. And so I think when people say think about saving, they too often think about, well, let's just get you back to the blood family. But a lot of people don't want to go back to the blood family because the blood family was what screwed them over. So the question becomes, how do you solve these problems? Because if I suffer a moment of addiction, if I go through a bad spell, which I've done in my life, and then I go to rehab, and then I'm released from rehab into the arms of my family, none of which are addicts, all of which live, all of which accept me and don't reject me. If Takesha goes through detox, which she's done multiple times, and then she's released, she goes back to her street family because that's the only family she has, and they're all addicts. So she's very unlikely to stay clean. I think of one, I don't think she made the book. I can forget her name. One of the more depressing moments of this, I don't know if it made the book or not, was can't remember her name. She disappeared from Hunts Point, from the Bronx. She was a prostitute, addict, homeless, like everybody else there that I wrote about. And she disappeared for 8 months, and nobody knew what happened to her. Everybody was worried. So people started talking about death and all these awful things. But she had gone to rehab and been mandated for 8 months, and I found her back in the Bronx 8 months later, carrying a box of Bibles to give. She looked great. She had not done drugs in 8 months. She was in great shape. She was smiling. She was laughing. She had energy, and she had a box of Bibles. She was going down to the drug trap to share with her street family to help them. She was going to bring the good word to them because the good word had saved her. And that was like 4:00 on a Wednesday afternoon, let's say. And she was happy, and I took a picture of her, and she just wanted me to take a picture of her. She was so proud. And then that was Wednesday afternoon, let's say. And then Friday afternoon, I crawl into one of the drug traps that was underneath that was underneath a bridge. And there she is, completely nude, having just done a bundle of heroin over the, and she had relapsed. She had kind of gone under the tunnel to give the Bibles and got pulled back in. And she was in awful shape. She was nude. She was filthy. She had blood on her. And her arms were swollen from having done 10 hits of heroin. And, she had gone back home. But home was, a place where people did drugs. And so she was back.
You make the comment, you're accepted there as long as you keep doing the drugs.
That's right.
They'll accept you. But that's a pretty high bar, really. So you're not really accepted. I mean, they feel they're accepted. They feel that they're part of the community, but the community puts very, very high demand.
I mean, I think they would say that the high demand often is, I think it is a high demand, and it's, but if your predilection is towards using drugs and you find a community that accepts you for using drugs, one of the things I try to communicate in the book, and it's something that I don't think a lot of people like to admit, is that drug use is very communal. It's a bonding exercise. Crack houses are places filled with people. They're little bars. People go to socialize, and so people use drugs partially for the communal aspect of using drugs. I mean, they use drugs for other reasons too, but the communal aspect helps people, and that's part of the appeal of drugs. And I think that you have to recognize that if you want to figure out a way to lessen that appeal, you have to provide other forms of community, which is why AA and all the Narcotics Anonymous and all these other rehab centers focus on community, to provide people another form of community, going to the meetings as a way to replace going to the bar or going to the crack house.
So have you at all run into any of, say, Jordan Peterson's teaching?
I'm familiar with this stuff. I will say that I wasn't crazy about how it got spun or how he presented himself. He seemed like somebody who wanted to get a lot of attention as opposed to letting the ideas get the attention.
Well, I'm actually going back.
No, I haven't seen his. I haven't read his earlier stuff. I haven't.
Got famous, yeah. So he wrote a book called Maps of Meaning, where he lays out the kind of narrative structure of everything, and points out from a cognitive psychology and behavioral and evolutionary psychology and philosophy and history standpoint, how narrative drives, how everything is based in narrative. And that ties into this whole issue of why community is so important to meaning as well. So the story, kind of the story that we tell ourselves about what our world is, influences how we move forward in life. And this gets into the whole postmodern thing about, are there really grand narratives? Is there a point in having a grand narrative? Is it even possible? Because everybody's thinking is so idiosyncratic, and we all have our own internal sense of logic that's different from everybody else's. And I mean, there are many arguments about all of this, and this is one of the things John Vervaeke gets into in his whole series on the meaning crisis as well, is exactly how do we think, how do we communicate, how does it affect our process and all of that. But when I started thinking about these children that are, I'm hung up on the children in your book, because it's just so heartbreaking to me to think of these children trapped in these impossible environments. I mean, we tend to have this belief that education is the way to success, and you even bring that up at the end of your book, that people tend to believe education is the way to success, but if they can't make it with education, then they feel rejected. They feel humiliated by not having been able to make it. But what is really the option? I mean, education, we have to at least provide the opportunity for education for people, because to just say, oh, well, education's not important, doesn't seem to be a valid response. So if education is important, then we have to start as early as possible with children, helping them get the best possible education. But what does that really look like? Is it learning a lot of stuff, or is it maybe getting the right story about the world so that you have some sort of hope for the future? You have some understanding about, you were talking about community, you're talking about the getting away from the materialist viewpoint and getting more towards a viewpoint that's more spiritual or more relational. All of those things, that could be something we do in early childhood education, so that children, first of all, they need to learn to read, because you can't have a life if you can't read. And that's been one of my soapboxes since 1980, when I first read Rudolph Flesch's book, Why Johnny Can't Read. We've destroyed the whole system of teaching reading in this country, and very few people get an opportunity to actually learn to read.
I think where I come down on the quote conservative side, if that's the divide, is you got to the family, the two parents. It doesn't. I don't care who they are. Well, two men, two women. I don't care. Two parents are better than one, and that's not to diminish what single mothers, single parents do.
Yeah.
But I also think the traditional family, meaning again, meaning not the sexes of the parent, but the idea that the family is important, and the extended family is important, and the extended family is a safety net and social system that raises a child, is also extremely important. And it's hard to raise a kid, and you need more resources, and two parents are better than one. But I also think that um, you have to recognize when the parents are a problem. And you mentioned the story of the two children in the shopping cart. It took me a while. It took me longer than it should have to call social services on them. And I hate to see children taken away from their parents, but these parents were clearly not able to support these kids. Even they were good parents; they were trying. I didn't see any signs of abuse. I didn't see anything other than, um, you know, but and also I'm very, very loath to call social services because I don't know the full story. I'm still only an outsider, seeing over the course of 3 days what was going on. I didn't have the full picture. But we right now, it's hard. It's hard for foster parents, for kids to end up in foster parents. We give the legal right to the blood parents, but I think in some cases it's better ultimately for the kids to end up in. I mean, I know the problem with foster homes. I'm not gonna, but you know, too many times I've seen kids caught in this limbo where the parents are trying to hold on to them, and I understand why the parents are trying to hold on to them, but the parents are not able to raise these children. These parents are, and then some of them are people who are my friends, and I will say this to them, that I think you need to let these kids go. I know you want to be in a different place eventually, but you're not going to be in that place right now, and you got to give those kids up, and you gotta move on, and you got to get yourself into a better position before you can have those kids again, and you got to stop, you know, fighting because it's better for the kids. So I think foster parents are a big answer to that. Again, I never want to advocate for people people being taken away from their parents, but there are parents who are just not able. I've watched too many kids who are forced to raise their parents, who are the ones who, people say, like, why don't some of these kids do well in school? It's because school is the last is the lowest down on their priority. They have to keep their parent. They have so much crap going on at home. They have to wake their uncle or grandmother or mother up to reminder of the court date so they don't get evicted. So I think we need to be a little bit more, and again, I'm not sure how you change that. It can't all be legislated. That can't all be social workers doing this, and it can't be all teachers doing this, and in many cases policemen who have to be social workers. We as a culture have to shift towards a place where we accept responsibility for the children we have, more than we do right now. And again, there's a lot of bad people who have used that language to do negative things, and I don't want to be caught up in those negative things. But I think there is need to be more responsibility towards children.
Well, you were mentioning the importance of a two-parent family, and that reminds me of, I think it's Larry Elder that's always using this data, that they're the three most important things is to finish high school, to not have children before you get married, and then to get married, or not have children before the age of 20, and to get married. And if you can accomplish those three things, you're like 5 times less likely to end up in poverty.
I think the problem is we've made it very hard to accomplish those three things for many people, in the sense that one of the universals I found, you want a narrative towards meaning. Having a child is a meaning-making experience. It gives people who have no sense of meaning an immediate narrative, an immediate story. They're a mother, they're a parent, and now they have a role. And so everybody wants to have kids. There's exceptions to that rule, but overwhelmingly across all classes, races, situations, people want to have children.
Mm-hmm.
Their American dream is, might be a little bit different from place to place, but it's to have that white picket fence, which might be different, to build a home, have children, raise them, and then retire and watch their children raise their grandchildren. The problem is that's hard to do for a lot of people because they don't have the economics to do that. You want people to buy it. You want people to put their economic house in order before having kids. But we've made it very hard to put the economic house in order, so people are still going to have kids anyways. The desire to have kids is such a strong desire that people will do it even if they can't put their economic and house in order. So I don't disagree with the sentiment, but the execution is hard because it's very hard for people to, it used to be that it used to be easier to walk out of high school into a job that gave you the financial stability to buy a home, get married, and then have kids. Without that pathway accessible to people, they're going to have kids. If by 25 you haven't been able to put your economic house in order, you want to have kids, and eventually you're going to have kids. So I think the emphasis to solve that problem needs to be less on scolding and more on making that pathway accessible for people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way we structure the economy has made it very hard for people my daughter's age to do that, to accomplish, to build a pathway to having children in the way that we all wish people would do it.
Well, I think one of the things we're stuck in right now is this vortex of so many topics are off limits, and yet if we don't open those topics up and talk about them realistically and look at them from all angles, we're not going to find solutions. And one of the biggest problems that's heading towards us, what you have in this book is going to be magnified many, many, many fold by the introduction of more and more robotics.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be.
And we're going to have, if we don't change the way we approach employment, we're going to have massive unemployment. So it seems to me that several things that we could do. One would be to put more of a focus on apprenticeships.
I agree with that.
And more of a focus on entrepreneurship, on creativity in coming up with new business models and new concepts of what people might want in such a world when robotics and AI are managing more of the world. There are going to be things that people want that other people can be providing, but we need to be thinking about those things, but we're not thinking about them because is it the fear maybe that keeps us from talking about things, or is it political correctness? I'm not sure exactly what it is that's keeping us from talking about it, but we can kind of agree on what the problem is, but our interpretations of what the problem is are widely different. And until we get together and share these interpretations and try to hold an open space for communication, I don't see how we ever get to the point where we find solutions for the problem.
I mean, again, I'm a person who believes that the solutions are rarely ever one thing. I think we need to I mean, you're right. There's going forward, these problems are going to magnify, and it's going to become more and more credentialism, or the need to be specifically trained for one thing is going to become more and more important. So the gap between people who don't have that resume and the people who do are going to grow. Um, and that's going to lead to more of the problems I document in my book. Um, you know, I completely agree on the trade school. I wish employers valued a community college as much as they value Stanford, but I can't make people change. I can't make, the bank I used to work for say, hey, I think I'll hire, you know, some kids from Ivy Tech Community College in Gary, Indiana, as much as I hire people from, Harvard. Um, I think we need the wealthy and elites among us could do a lot, are the ones who have to change, and we need to be a little bit more understanding and dismantle some of the gatekeepers we have, which I think Harvard and Princeton are awful institutions. I think they intentionally limit the number of applicants. If they wanted to change things, they could open up. They could devalue their they could devalue themselves if they really truly believed about changing equality, or building a more equal society. They would devalue the value their own institutions by opening it up to 10 times the number of students. You
Well,
know,
just look at MIT recently put all their courses online for free. So if Harvard and Yale did
that's a great.
the same
I mean, but I think the professors there could get off their high horse and go teach at state schools, and if they really believe in changing equal things. I think we could do a lot to dismantle, but no, that's not going to happen. The people who are at the top are not going to change the system. It benefits them, and why would they do that? And
to some extent, though. I mean, I see small openings for change here, and Scott Adams was talking about this the other day too. That if we get to a place where online education becomes the norm, which COVID has certainly opened the door to that, then like so many of these YouTubers get hundreds of thousands of hits, and so they make money off the ads and so forth. Teachers could become very, very teachers could become wealthy. Teachers who are good teachers who get lots and lots of students wanting to take their classes could end up being valued members of the intelligentsia, instead of being just teachers. They could be actually looked at with admiration and making a lot of money and doing a good job teaching the kids. And if college education went more towards this model of being online education, where people could pick and choose whatever they want to get and be more self-driven, it seems to me like that opens a little window. And you see this even with someone like Lex Friedman, who is a MIT professor, but he has his podcast and he interviews all kinds of people. Just watching his podcast, you can get a master's education in a lot of different topics because it's free. You can learn endless amounts of interesting information. It can change your thinking. The reciprocal narrowing we were talking about before, there's also a reciprocal broadening that comes when you open your mind just a little bit and you get some new idea, and that makes you hungry for more knowledge. And then the more knowledge you gain, the more your mind opens up, and it broadens your whole world.
yeah,
So
I think there's look, I never want to diminish the value of education. But again, I think we've put too much emphasis on education as a pathway to success. It's kind of the map of meaning. It's the only allowable meaning now, in some senses. It's the sacred form of meaning. It's the new religion in some ways. And so I have a lot of respect for places like the Colorado School of Mines, in technical schools and community colleges, and people who go to become auto mechanics, where they actually teach a skill that
Mhm.
isn't based on, you know, is less than the humanities. I'm not trying to diminish the humanities, but
Well,
I
but
think
that's still education, isn't it? So
yes,
you're,
it is. But I think we need to. I think the type of education we value is we put the emphasis in the wrong place.
yes, I totally
Um,
agree with that.
and,
Yeah.
but at the same time is I don't, again, I don't offer solutions in my book because I don't know about solutions. I think we're headed in a very bad place, and I'm trying not to be a downer too much, but I'm not very I'm not very optimistic because um, again, where I fall on the right is this all can't be legislated away. This is all this. There's no policies that this is a cultural problem. That's a problem with the way we as a society at a deeper level, what we value and why we value. And you know I don't know if it's too much individualism and not enough sense of community or what, but I think I don't know how you get to a place where we not only monetarily value somebody who's really good at being a fantastic parent or a fantastic teacher as much as we do somebody who makes a lot of money being a superstar in Wall Street. How do we move to a place where, I think about the young lady I met, who's in the book, young woman who chose to stay, didn't go off to college, and chose to stay in her town to be her mom's translator to help take care of her parents. You know, that's something that's, I think, a very noble choice, and yet she's going to be ultimately hurt by it, by our society, which is going to she's going to lose out on money to make less money, and in some places she's going to be looked down on as somebody who's not a go-getter. She should be out there doing things when in fact she's staying home to be a good daughter to her parents. So, you know, the problem is we value we just value these very narrow things as a society, and I again, you can't change that. I don't know how. I can't tell you how to change that. I just I can be frustrated by it, but I don't know the solution to it.
Well, one of the things you said was that you don't have much optimism. And I probably was in that place a few years ago, but I have to say that in the last few years, my optimism has been growing just because part of what I do on my channel is talk to people. Um, and oftentimes some of the people I'm talking to quite a few, mainly young men, although some women, but mainly young men who found themselves in a very dark place, very nihilistic, very hopeless, maybe addicted, maybe just given up living in their mother's basement, eating Cheetos and playing video games. And 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 here's where Jordan Peterson comes in. They started listening to Jordan Peterson college lectures, and they got a picture of what their life could be. And because they got a new story, they sort of internalized a new story that it was possible to be a different kind of a person. It was possible to have agency and to have an aim and to have a direction, and that it was possible to get your trajectory moving upward instead of downward. And it revolutionized their lives. And and now they're in a completely different place.
Well,
Many
I
of
mean that's fantastic, and I think you know, but I think in many ways I view that as, and I mean this in a positive way, not a negative way. I view that as them finding a religion. It's not a traditional religion, but it's a religion, in the sense that that's why I emphasize so much faith in my book. As you need to find. You need. I always say that the kind of phrase I use. I don't know. I think I use in the book is people want to be a valued member of something larger than themselves. I think Jordan Peterson provides that. is a community. You know, the people who read his stuff and like his stuff and the speeches I've seen, he's telling them basically, you know, you can find a community, and here's the community. It's us. It's people like yourself who need a large, and part of what defines a religion or defines a community is a goal, is a shared goal. Um, and so I think he provides that goal. And you know, to the degree I understand what he talks about is if it's about responsibility, that's fantastic. You know, I mean, we all should be more, you know, responsible for our actions. So I do think there's some
Well, one
people
of
have
the other things that he talks about is that the goal actually has to be so high that you have to fix your gaze above the horizon at the highest possible good of which you can conceive, because it's that trust that speaking the truth, even if speaking the truth results in a negative consequence to you, that it still is it's still good because the world is good. So having this concept of the highest possible goal of good being something that actually exists. And because of that, many of these people that have started down the path of learning what he's teaching ultimately end up as people of faith, ultimately end up become very involved in a church of some kind or another.
Oh, that's good.
So,
I'm a big believer in faith. I think it's again, going back to what I said early on, I keep on thinking that our problem is we don't have enough faith. And faith can be a very broad term. It doesn't have to be, you know, mainline Christians, or it doesn't have to be, you know, it can be Buddhism. It can be, there's a lot of different renderings of faith, but being a part of a community that regulates and integrates you. The regulation is as important as the integration. You know, that's the problem with you know, drug places as communities, is they don't regulate. You know, they don't give you or they don't give you. I mean, there's a rule set, but it's not particularly one that limits what you can do. So I think, you know, traditional religions, they serve two roles. They integrate, you're part of a community, and then they regulate. They give you rules to live by, and people like both. People are more comfortable when they're, you know, when they have guardrails. Um, so
well,
I think
one of the other things that you said was that one of the things that you liked about church is that it doesn't require a credential, because so many of the people that you were running into didn't have credentials, and so they felt shut out of a lot of places that required credentials, but church didn't require a credential. I thought that was really interesting insight.
that's right. I mean, I call it non-credential forms of meaning. Now there's good ones in my mind, um, you know, like church. There's bad ones like drugs. You know, so the problem is that we only really require meanings that have the sacred form of meaning currently. The one that the elites value the most is credentials. Is places you have to have a resume to enter. Institutions you need a resume to enter. Institutions you don't need a resume to enter are far and few between these days, and I think we need to value them as much as possible. And you know, Jordan Peterson is an example of a non-credential form of resumes. It says his books or his movement or his lectures say, you know, hey, you sitting in a basement eating Cheetos, playing, you know, playing PS4. I don't care about your resume as long as you buy into this. You're welcome. And so I think those are positive in that sense, and unless, you know, that can also be dangerous because there are people who can come in there and say, you know, in some senses, right-wing politics and racist politics. I mean, you know, racist politics, white nationalism is another thing that does that. You know, it says, I don't care about who you are as long as your skin color is my skin color, and you hate other people's skin color, you can join. So, you know, there's
Well, you saw some of that when you were
yeah,
traveling around,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, there's good forms of it and there's bad forms of it. And my the warning I try to give the elites out there is, if you don't provide good forms of it, the bad forms of it are going to thrive. And so you better recognize the good ones, and faith is one of the good ones. If you don't want the bad ones, you need to value faith.
Well, I've really appreciated your willingness to give me so much of your time.
Oh, no problem. Zoom is wonderful.
I was wondering about one last question I might ask, and that would be, this whole trajectory and experience that you had, how would you say it has changed you as a person?
um, at a very silly level, I eat at McDonald's a lot. But at a deeper level, I mean, I'm more spiritual. I'm definitely no longer the math kid. I spend as much time. Um, I spend more time and put more emphasis on things that are about faith, and things that are about things that you can't model, things that you can't write in numbers. And I do go to church. Well, not anymore. I can't, like you. Um, so I think there's a large role of kind of what I 20 years ago would have. I never laughed at it because that's not who I am, but I would have just rolled my eyes at the kind of wishy-washy, quote, spirituality. That's the stuff I like these days, and that's who I am much more, and where I'm much more comfortable than I was 20 years ago.
Well, it's been a privilege to talk to you.
And thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm always flattered when anybody reads what I wrote. So, especially a book.
Well, I'll send you a link to this when it publishes, probably towards the end of the week.
Okay.
Maybe it'll be early next week, not too sure. And when I do, I hope you stop in and take a look at the video, because my
I will.
comment section is wonderful. My commenters always have just wonderful comments. And
I should have probably asked you this before, but where are you on the political spectrum, or where are your listeners? I hope I didn't
I'm
say anything
I'm
offensive.
I am totally on my show. I'm totally non-political. So I talk to people of many different
Okay.
political viewpoints,
I
but
hope I didn't offend any of your readers.
my economic viewpoint tends to be more towards the and I know this is an inexact term, but tends to be more towards free market economics.
Yeah, that's
I know
okay.
it's impossible to be. It's not really a free market. I understand that, and and I get
So
all this.
more towards a libertarian camp.
Um, Probably not, because I am very pro-life. I'm very,
Okay.
very pro-life. So libertarian camp probably would think of that as being intrusive, but to me, it's
Gotcha.
sort of baseline.
So religious right.
I don't like labels at all, and I definitely wouldn't say religious right. I wouldn't say that.
Okay. The you come from Iowa, right?
I lived in Iowa for a time, and when I was in Iowa, I became a Christian for the first time when I was 32 years old.
Where did you grow up?
Well, my father was in the military, so
Okay.
I was born in Alaska when he was on mission there, and then we moved to Colorado, and then we moved to Minnesota, and then I was 5 years old, 4 years old, and my dad had to go to Germany and help with the reconstruction of the Second World War. And my mother and my brother and I didn't go over to meet him for a year, so we went to meet him when I was 5. We lived in Germany, then we lived in Italy, and we came back
All over.
and lived in New York.
Military kid.
Yeah, so then
And
we moved to Maine. Then I was 9 years old.
where was your dad from?
My dad he was born in Marshall, Minnesota.
And your mother?
She was born in Red River, Minnesota. Red River.
So German heritage?
Yeah, my mother was German, English, and French Irish, and my father was Swedish and Norwegian.
Because the reason I keep asking is you look a lot like my wife's family, who were from Nova Scotia. So like there's startling resemblances to some of my aunts, my wife's aunts. So,
It's the first time I've ever heard that, but I'm sort of a mutt. I mean, I'm a little bit of everything.
but I mean, there are so many resemblances that I figured that they were kind of French, Canadian, German, Norwegians. So,
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. I guess it's a look.
all right. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to go take care of my kids. And I appreciate the time. And send me a link when done. And I'm going to look up. I'm going to look up
John
um,
Vervaeke.
Vervaeke. And I hope I gave you what you wanted, and I wasn't too obtuse.
Oh no, it was wonderful conversation.
All
I
right.
really appreciated it. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Bye bye.